In 1864, Union infantrymen stumbled upon 23 children hidden within a Georgia plantation basement. These captives shared hauntingly similar traits: prominent cheekbones, emerald eyes, and reddish hair glinted with gold. When federal troops breached the heavy iron portals of the Thornhill estate in Burke County, they discovered these youths huddled in the gloom, ranging from 4-year-old toddlers to 13-year-old adolescents. The oldest girl whispered a revelation to the officers that turned the stomachs of even the most battle-hardened veterans. "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot depart because we are her own flesh." Military documents from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry record this event just once in a classified letter, secreted away in regimental files for over a century. Local Burke County chronicles omit the Thornhill lands entirely, acting as though the manor and its mistress were myths, yet they were real. The world Catherine Thornhill constructed during the 16 years between her spouse's passing and the arrival of Northern soldiers remains one of the most sickening eras in American history, a meticulous breeding scheme intended to produce generations of bound laborers who could never flee their servitude because they were biologically inseparable from their master. Before we delve further into the account of Catherine Thornhill and the horror she cultivated in rural Georgia, I must ask a favor. If this narrative is unsettling you, please subscribe to this channel now. We explore the darkest recesses of the American past, the tales excluded from textbooks, and the secrets buried in dusty archives. I also want to hear from you. Please comment with your current location. Are you near Burke County? Does your own town harbor forgotten secrets like these? Let us explore them together. Now, we return to the genesis. A freezing February morning in 1847, when a young widow took control of a failing estate and drafted a strategy that would haunt the region for decades. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill entombed her husband was the harshest Burke County had witnessed in 20 years. The Thornhill property spanned 1,700 acres of crimson clay soil 7 miles from Waynesboro. In 1847, this was cotton territory, though less affluent than the fertile regions to the west. The earth here was exhausted, drained by years of monocrop agriculture. Estates that thrived in the 1820s were faltering by the 1840s, squeezed by plummeting prices and mounting overhead. The Mexican War had pulled away labor, and political tension over westward growth fractured the community. The Thornhill Manor had once been a premier property. Catherine's late husband, Jonathan, inherited it in 1838 with 42 enslaved laborers and manageable liabilities. However, Jonathan was an incompetent administrator and a compulsive bettor. By the time a winter contagion took him in 1847, the land was heavily leveraged. The acreage barely produced enough to sustain the workers, and debt collectors were closing in. Catherine was 28 at the time of her widowhood. She had wed Jonathan at 19, a marriage orchestrated by her father, Theodore Danforth, an elite merchant in Augusta. The Danforths were established Georgia aristocrats, descended from 18th-century pioneers. Catherine was highly educated by private instructors, spoke fluent French, and was prepared to oversee a grand house. She did not anticipate inheriting a bankrupt farm and a 16-year-old stepson, Richard, who viewed her with pure resentment. Richard was the product of Jonathan's first marriage. His mother had died during his birth in 1831. He never accepted Catherine, seeing her as a replacement for his lost mother. He was a moody, intellectual youth who preferred the library to the farm. Catherine viewed him as fragile and dangerously compassionate toward the laborers. When he once proposed teaching the workers to read, Catherine forbid the topic permanently. The manor house reflected this decay, a 2-story brick structure with 6 pillars built in 1805. Paint was cracking and the roof was failing. The interior was a patchwork of family heirlooms and cheap replacements used to cover gambling losses. Behind the main residence sat the kitchen, smokehouse, and dairy, all crumbling. Beyond the oak trees lived 31 remaining enslaved people, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. 16 others had been sold to pay debts. Fear was constant in the quarters. Catherine spent the month following the funeral in a state of icy resolve. She consulted with her attorney, Ambrose Talbot, who offered 2 grim paths: sell everything to pay debts and live as a dependent in Augusta, or find a way to make the land profitable, a feat he deemed impossible. Catherine rejected both. Retreating to Augusta meant admitting defeat and living as a social failure. However, she knew standard farming wouldn't work. The soil was dead, and she lacked the capital to buy more labor. During a night spent over financial ledgers, Catherine devised her plan with the cold logic of a predator. If she couldn't buy labor, she would manufacture it. Not through the casual methods of other plantations, but through a rigid, controlled system. She would create a workforce biologically linked to the estate, her own descendants who would possess an innate bond to the land because it was in their DNA. The concept was hideous, but to Catherine, brilliantly efficient. She was still in her childbearing years. She would pick the most robust men among the enslaved population to father her children. These offspring would be raised knowing their heritage, given slightly better conditions to foster loyalty, and eventually paired with other laborers to expand the population. Within 2 decades, she calculated she would have 50 workers bound by blood. She documented this in a ledger she called her cultivation records, using a substitution code to hide her activities. Children were labeled seedlings, men were rootstock, and pregnancies were plantings. Her first choice was Isaac, a 24-year-old known for his physical power. She summoned him to the house in March 1847. Her journal entry read, "First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear." By April, she was certain of her pregnancy, noting it with the same detachment one might use for a crop report. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Richard first sensed something was wrong in late May. Catherine stopped her morning tours, claiming the heat was too much. She ate in seclusion and dismissed her regular servants. In June, Richard hid in the library and overheard a conversation between Catherine and Miriam Grayson, a local midwife known for her discretion. Miriam questioned the timing of the pregnancy, noting Jonathan had died in February. Catherine lied smoothly, claiming they were intimate just before his illness. Richard, who had nursed his father through that fever, knew it was a physical impossibility. The child had been conceived after Jonathan's death, likely fathered by Isaac. Richard realized that if this scandal broke, the family would be ruined, yet he was more horrified by the deception. Catherine intended to pass this child off as a legal heir. Richard began spying on his stepmother, noticing Isaac's frequent late-night visits to the main house and Catherine's oddly clinical interactions with him. In August, Richard picked the lock on Catherine's desk and found the coded journal. After 3 days of decoding, he discovered the full extent of her breeding project. It was a manual for human livestock. Richard copied the pages, intending to expose her, but Catherine noticed his interference. She threatened him at dinner, implying that any scandal he started would only result in his own destruction. Richard burned his evidence in fear, but soon after, his health began to fail. He suffered from extreme lethargy, headaches, and muscle tremors. Catherine became his primary nurse, serving him medicinal soups and tonics. Richard realized he was being systematically poisoned with arsenic, but he was too weakened to flee. He made one last attempt to mail a letter to his grandfather, giving it to a young girl named Pearl. Terrified, Pearl gave the letter to Catherine instead. Catherine burned the letter in front of the dying boy, telling him his fever was making him imagine things. Richard died on December 3, 1847. The local doctor blamed consumption. 4 days later, Catherine birthed a son, Jonathan, claiming he was premature. Over the next several years, the estate appeared to flourish, but the growth was fueled by nightmare. Catherine had 4 more children by 1853, Eleanor, Abigail, Margaret, and Samuel, all delivered by the well-paid Miriam Grayson. The midwife also served as an enforcer, using herbal compounds to terminate any pregnancies among the enslaved women that didn't fit Catherine's genetic plan. One woman, Ruth, tried to resist in 1851 after becoming pregnant by a man she actually loved. Catherine had her hunted down by dogs and forced her to undergo a procedure that broke her spirit. Ruth died 2 years later. By 1856, Catherine had 7 children of her own living in the house. They were legally listed as property but lived as orphans she had taken in. They were being groomed, taught to read and write in secret, preparing for the day they would become the primary breeders of the Thornhill legacy. Catherine continued her work, bearing 3 more children between 1854 and 1856, William, Henry, and Caroline, each fathered by a different man chosen for physical traits. To her, they were never family. They were simply the finest genetic material for the future of the estate. The circumstances were beyond extreme. These men were coerced into fathering children they were forbidden to acknowledge, nurture, or shield. In 1855, a 26-year-old named Thomas, who was married to a woman named Hannah in the quarters, was summoned to the manor. Hannah was then expecting their first child. When Thomas attempted to reject Catherine's demand to use him for breeding, the sadistic overseer, Virgil Cain, had him lashed 39 times before the entire enslaved community. Despite the scars that would mark his back forever, Catherine forced him into the main house regardless. Thomas submitted. There was no alternative. He never spoke to Hannah of the violation, and she never pressed him. Some truths were simply too toxic to give breath to. By 1856, the Thornhill estate maintained a facade of normalcy that masked Catherine's perverted logic. The population was stratified into 3 tiers. The field workers, roughly 20 adults and their offspring who labored over cotton and maize under Cain's lash. The domestic staff, 4 individuals who managed the internal workings of the mansion. The special children, 10 youths by 1856, ranging from infants to 8-year-olds, who existed in a bizarre social limbo. The people in the quarters viewed these children with a mixture of resentment for their comforts and profound pity for their purpose. While they lacked the modern vocabulary of eugenics, the enslaved community recognized the pattern. They saw Catherine measuring the children like livestock and recording their growth in her hidden ledger. They waited in terror for these children to reach puberty, knowing Catherine intended to use her own biological offspring to breed a permanent, self-sustaining workforce, a labor pool bound by blood and law that could never be sold away. The isolation of the estate, 7 miles from Waynesboro via nearly impassable roads, ensured this horror remained a secret. Catherine played the role of the pious widow perfectly during her rare social outings. Even her attorney, Ambrose Talbot, turned a blind eye. As long as the cotton yields rose and the debts vanished, he saw no reason to investigate the source of the estate's growing human capital. Catherine had simply taken the inherent cruelty of the slave system and pushed it to its most efficient, monstrous conclusion. However, by 1859, the outside world began to bleed into Thornhill. As national tensions over slavery escalated toward the Civil War, Catherine remained obsessed with her heritage room, a windowless sanctuary in the East Wing. This room was a shrine to her experiments, filled with coded journals, vials of the children's hair, and elaborate breeding charts. She mapped out future pairings with clinical precision, Abigail with Thomas's son Jacob, Eleanor with Marcus. She envisioned a future where 100 workers, all sharing her DNA, would labor on her land forever. The war began in 1861, and the death of her overseer, Virgil Cain, at Shiloh, weakened Catherine's grip. Her replacement, the elderly Silas Kendrick, lacked Cain's brutality. As news of the Emancipation Proclamation drifted through the secret networks of the enslaved, Catherine grew desperate. She accelerated her timelines. In 1862, she married her eldest son, 15-year-old Jonathan, to a 16-year-old girl named Rachel in a hollow ceremony. Jonathan, thoroughly brainwashed, accepted this as his duty. Rachel, paralyzed by trauma, remained silent. The breaking point arrived in 1863 when 14-year-old Eleanor, Catherine's second child, discovered and decoded one of the secret journals. Reading the cold entries describing her own conception, labeled Second Planting with Rootstock 2, Eleanor realized the man she knew as the field hand, Thomas, was her father, and her benefactor was her mother. She confronted Catherine, who didn't deny the truth, but instead used it as a weapon. She threatened Eleanor with a sail to the Deep South, to the killing fields of Mississippi, if she didn't comply. Catherine's mistake was underestimating Eleanor's resolve. While Jonathan was too indoctrinated to rebel, Eleanor whispered the truth to her younger sisters, Abigail and Margaret. The atmosphere in the mansion turned icy. Catherine tried to restore order through a public display of violence in August 1863 after a pregnant girl named Grace tried to escape. Grace was captured and whipped before the entire estate, but the act backfired. Instead of instilling fear, it signaled to the workers that Catherine was losing control. As 1863 drew to a close, Eleanor began sneaking into the woods at night to meet with the elders in the quarters. She sat in circles with women like Hope, trading the secrets of the mansion for the wisdom of the fields. They were no longer two separate groups. They were a unified force biding their time. They knew the Yankees were coming, and they knew that the walls of Thornhill and the twisted legacy Catherine had built were finally starting to crumble. In her 40s, Hope surveyed Eleanor with a complex mixture of pity and admiration. "Your mother believes she constructed something exceptional here," Hope remarked softly. "She thinks she forged a family. In truth, she only bred people who despise her in ways she cannot comprehend." When Eleanor inquired about the post-war future, Hope noted that it hinged entirely on the victor. A Union triumph meant liberation, while a Confederate win meant stagnation, or worse. Regardless, Hope insisted the cycle had to break because the secret was out, and the anger was too heavy to carry. "What if we broke it ourselves?" Eleanor suggested. The idea hung in the air, both terrifying and alluring. Hope reminded her of the risks. They were 40 against 2, but half were children. More importantly, where would they run? If captured, they faced death or being sold further south. She also challenged Eleanor's identity, asking if she would be seen as a victim or an extension of the mistress. Before Eleanor could answer, the sound of crashing brush forced them to scatter into the night. No immediate punishment followed, but the seeds of rebellion had been sown. The breaking point arrived in March 1864. A Confederate cavalry unit swept through Burke County, seizing corn, meat, and horses. Their presence brought fatalistic news. General Sherman was advancing, and the war was effectively lost. While the workers felt a surge of hope, Catherine felt only the impending collapse of 16 years of work. If her special children were freed, her legacy would vanish. On the night of March 17th, she gathered all 11 of her biological children in the Heritage Room. She revealed her ultimate protection, laudanum. She intended to poison them all, rather than see them enter a world where they belonged nowhere. Jonathan, now 16, stood between his mother and his siblings. He revealed he had read her journals and seen the truth of his parentage. When Catherine slapped him, he didn't flinch. Instead, Eleanor stood by his side, calling her a monster who used people as tools. Realizing she had lost her children's loyalty, Catherine made a final, manic decision. If the living legacy was gone, the written record must survive. She grabbed her journals and hair samples and fled toward the quarters, pursued by Jonathan and Eleanor. Chaos erupted in the darkness as the mistress collided with the people she had brutalized. By the time the children arrived, Catherine had vanished. Her journals were trampled in the mud, and her specimens were shattered. Hope simply told the children that their mother was gone and wouldn't return. She gave them a choice: seek vengeance for a woman who never loved them, or accept that justice had been served. They chose to let it rest. The official record noted her as missing, likely fled from the Yankees, but the truth remained buried in the Georgia red clay. After the war, the Thornhill estate fell into a legal and physical decay. Jonathan tried to manage the land, but eventually abandoned it in 1869, moving west under a pseudonym, haunted by the fact that he never chose his existence. Eleanor moved to Savannah, marrying a carpenter and living a quiet life as a seamstress, never bearing children of her own. In 1871, the discovery of a female skeleton with a crushed skull in an old cistern on the property confirmed what the black community already knew. Justice had been enacted by those who had been treated as property. Though a 1923 discovery of Union Captain Samuel Reynolds's letters briefly brought the grotesque breeding program to light, the story was largely suppressed or forgotten by the white establishment. Today, the Thornhill site is nothing but forest and leaf fall. There are no markers for the 23 children found in the basement or the generations of forced labor. Yet, Catherine's genetic legacy likely lives on in descendants who have no idea their ancestors were part of a systematic eugenics experiment. We honor the survivors by remembering that they were more than the roles Catherine assigned them. They were human beings who outlasted a system designed to strip them of their souls. If this deep dive into one of America's darkest chapters moved you, please share your thoughts below.